Apajikachinendam, Akanakabijayan Nungum. It's such an honor to see each and every one of you here. Anin, Buju, to each and every one of you for coming here to Treaty 1 territory. We acknowledge that we are gathered here on the Treaty 1 territory, and I also acknowledge and hold up and host the drum. Thank you so much for being here, Coco, and your team. I'd also like to thank our elders. Give me 1 second. Our elder Ed Hayden, of course, and Dolly Wilson and Leonard, thank you so very much for opening up this assembly in a good way. We also acknowledge the Eagle staffs and all the ceremonial items. We acknowledge Treaty 1 chiefs for welcoming us to their lands. Thank you so very much. We also lift up Manitoba Grand Chief Kyra Wilson, Regional Chief Moore, for your ongoing leadership and your assistance with planning this week's event. I also want to just say a special mention of AO Grand Chief Alex McDougall, MKO Grand Chief Garrison Setti, SCO Grand Chief Daniels. Thank you all for welcoming us here. It's been 11 years since AFN has hosted a national assembly in Manitoba. And of course we had planned previously, but Manitoba's previous government was tough on us, and they put us into one of the darkest and most divisive election campaigns that this province has ever seen. So I want to thank Manitobans for standing up to that hatred during the last election. It was really hard as a First Nations person to see billboards speaking up against our women that were voiceless in landfills. And I want to thank Manitobans that stood up and stood against that, because you kind of had that moment where you said, are people going to do the right thing and stand up against this? And I want to thank all of you and the leaders in this territory for your principled leadership of our chiefs, and of course the election of Premier Canoe. And we are so thankful to you, Premier Canoe, for that work. We want to start with a few words today about the Manitoba Chiefs hosting us this week. For those of you that don't know, my home community is just a couple of hours up the road from here. And I grew up surrounded by my family, my language, and my culture in Penamotang First Nation. And I feel so blessed that I was able to grow up with my parents are here, Garnet and Lorette Woodhouse, if you could just stand. And I'm so busy, and I know that I'm always taught since I was a little girl that you have to honor your parents, honor your grandparents. Mom and Dad celebrated 52 years last week, and I was busy, but I honor you now. Yeah, thank you. And I'm so also think of my grandmother, that's above my grandmother and my great-grandmother, because without that gift of being surrounded by your culture and by your language and by your families, I couldn't be here today. And so our Manitoba Chiefs have been a family for me too, since I was a little girl. And so for my entire adult life, I've worked for Manitoba First Nations and now nationally, but and they've been there for me. And so I sincerely thank the Chiefs in this province for your ongoing guidance and your inspiration. And of course, one of those leaders was Broken Head Ojibwe Nation Chief Jim Bear, that sadly passed away last week. So I thank him for his commitment that we've seen such a beautiful tribute today. We've lost a few other great leaders over the past year as well. It was a week ago this week, just steps from here, on the steps of the Manitoba Courthouse, that Grand Chief Kathy Merrick suddenly passed away. Months later, just a few streets from here, we paid tribute to the late Justice Murray Sinclair in a fitting national memorial. They remain as a beacon of hope for all of us, and we feel their spirit with us here this week. When we think of resilience and strength over the past year, we also think of the brave families of our Manitoba sisters, Mercedes Myron, Rebecca Quantoise, Ashley Shingus, and Morgan Harris. It has been an emotional year. Yeah. It's been an emotional year, but I know that when we speak on behalf of all chiefs in Assembly in expressing our respect and our love for each of you, and we will continue to stand with you. For 3 long years, these families carried an unimaginable burden for their loved ones that they should have never had to fight for, and they should have never had to fight that hard. Rebecca, Morgan, Mercedes, and Ashley were entitled to live free of violence, and they deserved respect and dignity in death. It is in their honor, we renew our Assembly's call, all of us, for an independent inquiry into the response of the Winnipeg Police and the previous provincial government regarding their decision in these cases. They need to be held account. So a lot has happened over this past year. We could spend the whole Assembly talking about the past year, but there are a few things that I want to touch on, starting with the release of the First Nations Justice Strategy in June. We lift up all the chiefs, the leaders, the experts that helped co-develop this landmark strategy with Canada. It represents a blueprint for positive change on two clear paths. First, it pushes us to revitalize First Nations laws and legal systems. And second, pushing us, of course, to reform the criminal justice system. And it was also an honor to stand with Corey Wilson, chair of the BC First Nations Justice Council, on Parliament Hill for the release of this strategy. Corey's work and the Justice Council's response to systemic discrimination and overrepresentation of First Nations in the justice system make this strategy a priority for all of us. I'd mentioned Chief Merrick and Justice Sinclair earlier as great leaders we lost over the past year, but we also think of people like Chief Bill Wilson. He was such a fearless advocate for our rights and for our freedoms. We thought of him during the debate in Ottawa on Bill C-5. Because Chief Wilson spoke hard truths on governments, he challenged them to do better for First Nations and by First Nations. And we all need to do that now more than ever before. We will be leaning on Chief Wilson's guidance and his life's work over the coming months as we fight in Ottawa to honor the calls to action, the calls for justice, and the United Nations Declaration. And we will be leaning on the AFN justice strategy in Parliament this fall when Canada introduces new bail and sentencing laws. First Nations voices must be heard on these important pieces of legislation. Never again should rights holders be shut out of Parliament like what happened for Bill C-5. The history of the Crown First Nations relationships demonstrates that we have to overcome great odds to protect our rights, our laws, our lands, our resources, and our waters. First Nations have learned through hard experience that if we don't mobilize to protect our rights, no one else will. We have fought in Parliament, we have fought in the courts, and we have fought on this land to protect our rights as people and as nations. Nothing has been given to us, and we are not going back. With justice reform, water will be another key issue for us in Parliament this fall. Because water is life, it sustains us. It sustains our spirits, our traditions, and our ways of life. And a low point of the last year, watching Ottawa, was watching parliamentarians play politics with the health of First Nations children by letting the Clean Water Act die last fall. We can't ever let that happen again either. During the election forum we hosted in April with Prime Minister Carney, he had committed to introduce a clean water bill as quickly as possible if he was elected. We need to hold him to this promise because the Alberta and Ontario governments are already playing politics with water. Last month, they called for the Prime Minister to stand down on that promise to our people, so shame on them. So today, we call on Canada to stand up to the provinces and honor the Prime Minister's commitment, and we're going to continue to do that because he needs to reintroduce the First Nations Clean Water Act as one of Parliament's first deeds this month. And I know they're listening. Looking back over the past year, we imagine Chief Wilson, Justice Sinclair, Grand Chief Merrick would be all pretty proud of all of you sitting here today and being here at this important time. We are witnessing a shift in this country, Chiefs, and you are all part of it. With each day, more Canadians recognize that Canada's economy will not achieve its full potential until we also have a strong First Nations economy. The truth is that First Nations businesses already contribute over $50 billion to Canada's GDP. This represents a 57% increase over the previous decade. The rest of Canada only grew by 37% during the same period. The truth is that over $560 billion of projects are forecasted to be launched on First Nations lands over the next decade. The benefits can be measured in the trillions of dollars. But these opportunities, they represent a cornerstone of Canada's future economic growth, but that will not advance without First Nations support, and they know it. In addition to our economic strength, chiefs from all regions of this country are stepping up for our people. We've seen, starting in Saskatchewan this spring, chiefs fighting, everywhere, been fighting on the front lines, fighting wildfires and helping evacuees. We lift them all up. We see that same thing again in the Northwest Territories with fires this week. We also think of the BC chiefs and the Ontario chiefs that were on the front lines of provincial government attacks on First Nations rights with fast-track bills this spring, so I lift them up. In recent weeks, we have also been inspired by the Quebec chiefs, challenging provincial forest policies that are trying to infringe on their rights. Thanks for their leadership, Quebec is revisiting those plans, so we lift up the Quebec chiefs. We also see the Yukon and the Northwest Territory chiefs leading the way on Arctic sovereignty, and we stand with you. And speaking of Arctic sovereignty, Alberta chiefs were also the first, earlier this year, they were the first to stand up to the Premier's threat to separate from Canada, as if she had land to take, Majiduk. Looking back over the past year, we also lift up the 8 First Nations members of Parliament elected to the House of Commons in April. 8 First Nations people from all different parties. I'm so proud of them. And First Nations voters right across this country lifting up their own people, making a difference in dozens of constituencies across this country. So for the first time, as you all know, the Assembly of First Nations, we invited all the party leaders to participate in a special forum with our chiefs where chiefs could put forward questions to each of them, and they all showed up to talk to you. After the election, we also celebrated the historic appointment of 2 First Nations women to cabinet. And we are so proud of Minister Rebecca Chartrand and Minister Mandy Golmasti, who was just last year Grand Chief with us, and we lift her up. Our women, they now have the chance to apply their understanding of our nations to advance reconciliation, implement treaty rights, and address long-standing gaps that discriminate against our people. One of those gaps relates directly to the health and well-being of First Nations children. Over the past year, we have started rolling out the historic $23 billion final settlement agreement we negotiated in 2023 regarding the discrimination that our First Nations Child and Family Services Program and Jordan's Principle. Payments started last month, and over 40,000 claims have been received so far. To see the compensation flowing just 5 months after the launching of that process is a very significant achievement, and I lift everybody up for that. And while we are pleased to see that many applications, we know that there are at least 160,000 more First Nations that are eligible to apply. We are honored also to have worked with the representative plaintiffs in the original case to reach this point. They have all demonstrated such strength and courage throughout this process. And while no amount of money can ever make up for the harms experienced, the compensation is an acknowledgement of the discrimination that they had suffered. As the settlement rolls out, we have unfinished business with Canada on the long-term reform of the discriminatory First Nations child welfare system. We lift up New Brunswick Chief Joanna Bernard and other chiefs and technicians from across this country for their efforts over the past year to set up the Special Chiefs Commission. We also lift up the chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation for ratifying their final agreement with Canada in February. But now Canada needs to come back to the table, and they need to protect the $47.8 billion that we negotiated last year in October's federal budget. Those funds are for First Nations children and families. They are not meant, Canada, you're listening? They are not meant to be redistributed as part of any budget-cutting exercise. On that note, I'd like to conclude today with a few words just about next month's federal budget. This was an important topic that came up at the Prime Minister's July summit. In the coming days and weeks, we will be focusing a lot of attention on October's federal budget. Federal budget must advance reconciliation and Canada's international obligations to respect our right to self-determination. This October budget will be the new government's first chance to commit to closing the infrastructure gap and address some of the mistrust created by Bill C-5. It is an opportunity to advance implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the principles and the calls to action, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Media were excluded from those discussions at the federal summit in July. Chiefs in attendance know that behind those closed doors, the budget was discussed with Prime Minister Carney. And when we asked about reports of federal cuts to First Nations budgets, the Prime Minister reassured chiefs at that meeting that he understood that more needs to be done, not less. The truth is that the persistent gap in socioeconomic outcomes between First Nations and the rest of Canada coincided with the 2% cap that was imposed for decades. Thankfully, new investments by the previous governments have started to make a difference. The most recent First Nations Wellbeing Index report concluded that the gap narrowed between 2016 and 2021. And this progress represents the largest gap closure between First Nations and the rest of Canada in the past 4 decades. So this is not the time to go back and undo that progress. That 2% cap was hard on our people. Over 20 years, there was no growth. So Canada has to listen again and remember that. The Prime Minister said that this reality was absolutely clear to him, particularly related to policing, to healthcare, to social services, to education and the infrastructure gap. So in response, the Assembly of First Nations, we presented our budget submission to Canada in August, as we do every year, and of course to make sure that we're pushing also for the fall, every fall economic statement that we're there, and spring. So we will share a summary of this week, but we are happy to talk about a few key elements with you before we conclude today. In addition to maintaining the $47.8 billion for child welfare reform and reflecting resolutions from chiefs, our budget submission responds to the new government's emphasis on capital investments, on essential service gaps, and building capacity for growth. Accordingly, we have included a significant emphasis on infrastructure. First Nations infrastructure priorities are matters of national interest and priority. Those needs cannot be just addressed by only trickle-down economics, what's being proposed. Specifically, we have called for strategic capital investments over 10 years to close Canada's $360 billion First Nations infrastructure gap in your communities. In addition to significant socioeconomic benefits to First Nations, this investment will create hundreds of thousands of jobs and more than offset the impact of Trump's illegal tariffs. To honor another commitment from the Prime Minister to chiefs, and as part of addressing that infrastructure gap, the AFN budget report also calls for an immediate $2.6 billion investment towards the delivery of a First Nations policing as an essential service, just like any other Canadian community enjoys. You deserve that too. First Nations citizens have rights under the Constitution and international law to safety and security. Too often, as we've seen in the past, discriminatory police action leads to serious injuries or deaths, over-policing, under-policing, and over-representation of First Nations people in federal corrections. The failure of federal and provincial governments to end discrimination in our First Nation policing and justice system contradict the spirit of reconciliation and the calls to action. Also, on education, to commemorate the 10th anniversary this year of the historic final report of the TRC Commission later in December, our federal budget submission also invites Canada to consider a once-in-a-generation investment in First Nations education, training, and languages. As Commissioner Sinclair reminded us in his life, that education got us into this mess, and education will get us out. That is why we are very concerned about reports last week about Canada terminating negotiation tables that were on the verge of completing important regional education funding agreements. Any efforts to cut the federal budget on the backs of First Nation students will set this country back on reconciliation and only serve to limit Canada's economic prosperity in the end. Canada is protecting provincial health, provincial education, and provincial service programs review for this year. They're not going to do reviews on them. And the same needs to apply for First Nations. We need to keep investing in those critical infrastructure for our kids. In addition to other essential community health investments, the Assembly of First Nations budget calls for an urgent $700 million investment to support First Nations-led mental wellness strategies and the distribution of more naloxone kits in your communities across this country. There will be a special session on this topic, and so we encourage your participation and your advice. And on the Building Canada Act, the AFN budget submission recommends an $800 million investment over the next 2 years to support First Nations review of national interest projects. As part of their Bill C-5 implementation plan, Canada has dedicated $40 million in funding to support First Nations participation in national infrastructure projects. And given the scale of the projects being suggested, threats to First Nations rights and the environment, this is very woefully inadequate. Canada has already tried to limit First Nations participation in the process to develop the Building Canada Act. So limiting resources required for fulsome First Nations participation in project assessment will only lead to court delays and more delays that many proponents wish to avoid. So they need to invest properly in First Nations to do that work. The capacity building investments we have proposed in this budget also include, of course, working with First Nations to ensure that they start to achieve that 5% federal target for actual First Nations businesses in procurement. Because Canada's non-enforced procurement standards are damaging to First Nations and, of course, to Canadians as a whole. Properly deployed, as we've talked about before, this First Nations procurement will deliver significant benefits to newly emerging economies. This is particularly true related to defense. And over the coming weeks, the AFN will prepare a response to invitation from Canada's Defence Department to chart a new course on First Nations procurement. On the Building Canada Act, of course, honoring promises in the next federal budget is going to be very important because First Nations are at a critical time in your nation-to-nation relationship with Canada. It is important to note that this week's Assembly is the first time that chiefs will formally gather to discuss resolutions on the Build Canada Act, since it was rushed through Parliament in June. We look forward to hearing your discussions, your debate on the policy resolutions brought forward by many chiefs, and we thank you for submitting your resolutions. The way the Act was introduced has caused concern for many chiefs. This Assembly is an opportunity for chiefs to deliberate and to provide direction moving forward. Important decisions will be made by the Cabinet under this legislation, we know that. Those decisions must respect your rights, your treaty and inherent rights and your title, and free, prior and informed consent. Despite the promises made by the new government, chiefs wonder if the Crown First Nations relationship, is moving backwards in this new age of U.S. colonialism. So until an appropriate process is established with First Nations rights holders, founded in free, prior and informed consent, the Crown's legal obligation cannot be met. This is another reason that outstanding First Nations treaty rights must be reconciled before any others, because Métis rights do not include rights over First Nations lands, over our territories, and over our resources. We have governed these lands since time immemorial and prior to colonial borders, and we just need to remind Canada that. Our rights cannot be implemented or respected without First Nations in substance and in process, and they cannot be respected after the fact. When federal and provincial governments tried to exclude First Nations from the process to repatriate the Constitution in the early 1980s, we successfully fought to ensure Section 35 was included to affirm our treaty and pre-existing inherent rights. Then First Nations were told that Section 35 was simply an empty box, that any rights that we thought that we had needed to be negotiated again through agreement. So again, you all fought, First Nations fought in Canada's court system, and we proved that wrong. No one talks about Section 35 as being an empty box anymore, and that's because I look at our veterans in front here, thank you, all of you, our old chiefs that are, many of them here are our elders that did all of this work for us. Because now there are hundreds of court decisions affirming the substance and strength of the Constitution affirmed of our First Nation rights. And we raise this critical history because First Nations rights have to be taken seriously and must. So despite the dark side of Canada's history, First Nations, regardless, have always fought for Canada during difficult times, during the War of 1812, during World War I, World War II, recently Afghanistan. First Nations have always been on the front line in high numbers. It's now another one of those times. And as First Nations, we stand with Canadians in condemning Trump's illegal tariffs. We support economic growth and prosperity for all, but not at the expense of our rights or the Crown's legal obligations to our people. Just closing off here, Chiefs, I just have to say you work unbelievably hard, and you put yourself on the line each day to help your communities and your families. It is my honor to be your advocate to many governments. I'm thankful to be in Ottawa every day. Ottawa's a different place, but I'll be there to work for you, to advance your priorities for your First Nation. Through it all, we will be there with you in the Assembly of First Nation that is here, all of our staff. Thank you. Just as our elders and our ancestors has wanted us to try and work together, even when it's difficult. And our work over the coming days will be complex, made much more intense by the many social, economic, and cultural challenges facing our people. There is much to do, but by strengthening our relations united, we can achieve anything. So I just want to say thank you so very much for being here today, and I look forward to hearing from you on how to move forward on these many different diverse issues that we all bring here today. Thank you. Chimigwech.